Hi, I'm Pete May, co-founder of GreenBiz Group, and I'm delighted to be here today with Kelly Rytel, who's a director with 3Degrees. Kelly, welcome to GreenBiz.
Thanks for having me, Pete.
Great to have you here, and tell us a little bit about how did you get into 3Degrees is obviously major consultancy in the climate change and sustainability space. How did you land into your role?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I think my environmentalist roots started way back. Early in my career, I thought that affordable housing was my generation's biggest crisis. So I was working in finance and real estate, and then along the way, I really realized that climate change was what I really wanted to dedicate my career to, and fighting climate change. So I went to grad school. I studied a lot about climate change in the Amazon, and I really sought out opportunities to be able to apply a lot of what I was learning. And 3Degrees was an excellent opportunity to work with corporates and other organizations who are really pushing the boundaries of trying to get to a 1.5 degrees C world.
Yeah, that's great. So I wanted to go through kind of a hypothetical and look at how you work with clients. Obviously, we're seeing today on the verge of our Verge Net Zero event. We see companies left and right are setting commitments for net zero. There's a lot of terms being bandied around. Companies are feeling like they need to do something, not trying to figure out to what degree they're doing that. Walk us through a little bit. I think you mentioned you did a couple stage process, and you start with something called assessing a company's doing climate intelligence assessment. What's that all about?
That's right. Yeah, well, so like any, goal setting exercise, you need a robust set of information and intelligence to be working from. So, of course, the obvious is a greenhouse gas inventory. So what are our actual emissions and where are they coming from? That is, the super vital, of the utmost importance. And then also being able to have access to look at it real time. And so, and then similarly, once you have that baseline, you can then back up and kind of look at the big picture. I think, typically companies look right to climate risks, and certainly that's a very important part of climate intelligence. I think, the task force for climate related financial disclosures is a forerunner in terms of structuring how to look at risk. But there's also, even within that framework, looking at opportunity. So climate opportunity is also a really important part, thinking about how the world needs to decarbonize and how your company can create products and services that are accelerating that transition. And we know consumers also prefer products that are more environmentally friendly. So there's also a competitive edge there. So, you look at your GHG inventory, you think also about your business strategy, and I was saying kind of the climate opportunity, and how can sustainability be weaved into the very fabric of your strategy. So that's not, that it's not an add-on, that it's truly integrated into what you're doing. So I think that's really where you start. And from there flows all the kind of operational and programmatic goals around reducing your operational emissions, also known as scope 1 and scope 2. So what fuels are you burning on site? Of course, value chain emissions are the most complex. So, but also typically where the most impact is. So this typically involves a lot of collaboration. So also under the umbrella of climate intelligence, typically looking at a life cycle assessment to really understand, right, are the emissions coming from the creation of the material or the creation of the product or the use of the product? So those are typically the two big areas that we see. And then you round out by the final looking at what your remaining emissions are and how you want to address those, typically through a carbon credit portfolio. So, that there's all different programmatic areas to look at. And so we really try to help companies just kind of take it step by step. Let's start with the GHG inventory, see what we find, and take it from there.
Yeah, so we know there's a lot of companies that are leaders getting out on this. Let's take a hypothetical too. Let's say it's a company that, I don't want to call them a laggard, but let's say they're relatively new to this discussion. They come to you, they engage 3Degrees, and they say, we understand that net zero is really big. We feel like we have to set a net zero commitment. Let's say it's a Fortune 100 company. What kinds of questions, what's things do you assess with them to try to figure out what is the right level of goal and when to make that commitment?
Absolutely. No, it's a great question. I really like to think about it in two different buckets. So you have the external forces and then you have the internal forces. So the external forces are things like, science. So Science-Based Target Initiative obviously is kind of, the market standard in terms of looking at the science and what emissions reductions are needed. So that, of course, is the baseline. Looking at what your peers are doing, as well as market leaders. So that is helpful context for decision makers. And then internally, you look at what initiatives are already underway. What level of ambition do you want to have? So the true leaders are really pushing the boundaries, and then there are a lot of fast followers, which they are taking cues from the people that are really at the leading edge. And so you just have to figure out where you are in that spectrum to be able to confidently, set a target. And then, of course, your internal inventory, right, drives what solutions are available. And you'll also have an idea at that point, kind of where are there solutions available today, particularly cost-effective solutions. So obviously renewable energy is a solution that a lot of companies start with for their scope 2 emissions. But then you just have a better idea of kind of like where's the technology at, where are we at, and how that timing works in context of your peers' timing, your ambition, all of those internal and external forces.
So I think my last question for you is really around this whole area of net zero goals. Some people look at what's going on and they say that's really commendable. Companies are making great commitments. Other people look and see that's not enough for the planetary urgency around that. And yet others will say that's just a form of greenwashing. I'm curious, Kelly, as your level of optimism as you look at the challenge around net zero, how optimistic are you about using net zero to move the needle?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there are certainly, criticisms around the term, but I really believe that there are a lot of companies that are using the term net zero to indicate a very high level of ambition. So, at the moment, we really do have to look at, kind of claim by claim to make sure that that the action behind the claim is something that is reputable and defensible and really meets the climate emergency. So I do think that it's also a really good communication tool internally, particularly if peers are using it in communicating with senior stakeholders, which oftentimes don't have an ESG, environmental, social governance background. So I think it is a powerful communication tool. But I do think at the end of the day, what we're seeing with the leaders are that they're incorporating net zero, but they're also incorporating other really important aspects of the tools that we need in the climate, to address the climate emergency, like looking at climate justice and like incorporating the nature crisis. So I think that this is, I think that this movement will continue, and I think there will be added dimensions to it over time as well.
Yeah, well, that's great. Well, Kelly Rytel from 3Degrees, you're going to have a lot of, you and 3Degrees will have a lot of work to do in this area, and we're excited to watch as that unfolds in the next year or two. Kelly Rytel, thanks for joining us today on GreenBiz Studio.
Thank you.